By the end of his life, he had fought more than 60 duels and lost none of them. But this is not a story about how he won. It is a story about what he was looking for and what he found long after the fighting was over. Tonight, I'll tell you a story from Japan.
He was still young the first time someone watched him fight and understood what they were looking at. The other man was older, trained, sure of himself. He came forward the way he had 100 times before. And then he was on the ground and it was over, and no one had quite seen how. The young man lowered his wooden sword. He was not breathing hard. He did not look proud or even satisfied. He looked like someone doing the one thing he had been made for. Already at that age, he moved as though he had all the time in the world, and everyone around him had none. He had come up hard. His mother gone early. His father a fighter who softened nothing for him. He left home young and never really had another one. What he had instead was the sword, and a question he could not put down. How good could a person become? Not good enough to win, he could already win. Good enough that winning stopped being luck or strength or nerve. Good enough that it became something closer to certainty. To find that out, he would have to fight the best men alive. So that is what he set out to do. Most swordsmen of his day carried 2 blades, but fought with one, keeping the short sword in reserve. He asked a simple question no one else had pressed. Why not both? Why let one hand stay empty? So he taught himself to fight with the long sword and the short sword at once, one in each hand, moving as a single thing. It took enormous strength and years to make it look easy. But underneath the method was the real idea. Command the distance, own the timing. See the whole of a man, not the tip of his blade. Win the fight first in your mind, and only then strike. His name began to travel ahead of him. And in time it reached Kyoto, where the most respected sword school in the country had trained fighters for generations. The Yoshioka. To challenge them was to challenge the whole idea that skill could be inherited, taught, handed down like a family name. He challenged them anyway. The head of the school agreed to meet him. A single duel on an open field outside the city. The Yoshioka students came to watch their master defend 100 years of reputation. They were very sure of how it would go. He arrived late, on purpose. He let the master of the school stand in the cold and the waiting, until all that certainty began to itch. And when he finally came, he ended it in a single blow. One strike of a wooden sword, and the head of the greatest school in Kyoto was on the ground with a broken arm, 100 years of reputation lying in the dirt beside him. It was not close. It was not even dramatic. It was a man who had solved a problem, meeting men who still believed the problem could not be solved. The school did not take it well. The master's younger brother came next to take back the family name. He was, if anything, angrier, and this time the blades were real. It changed nothing. He met the same quiet wall the first man had met, and he did not rise from it either. Twice now the Yoshioka had sent their finest against this wandering nobody. Twice he had walked away without a mark on him. So what was left of the school gathered in the dark and decided that skill had failed them, and that they would answer him instead with numbers. They set the trap at a place called Ichijoji, under a great spreading pine at the edge of the rice fields. Dozens of them, swords, bows, the young heir of the school placed out front as a figurehead, and the rest waiting in the trees to finish whatever the duel began. They expected him late again. So this time, he came early. He was already there in the gray before dawn, watching them arrange themselves in the mist. He went for the boy first, the one name that gave the ambush its right to exist, and then broke outward before the circle could close, both swords moving, taking each opening the moment it appeared, and was gone into the wet fields before the trap had ever truly shut. By now he had faced more men than he could easily count, and had never lost. But the fighting had begun to teach him something that had little to do with killing. He was seeing the shape underneath it, the instant before a man commits, the small place where fear leaks into his timing, the stillness that sits at the very center of speed. He wrote, much later, about a kind of emptiness a person reaches when they stop trying, where you simply see what is in front of you and answer it, with nothing in the way. He had gone looking for how good a man could become, and he was beginning to arrive. There was one man left who could tell him how far he had truly come. A younger swordsman named Sasaki Kojiro. Brilliant, elegant, undefeated, a genius of the blade who fought with a sword so long it should not have been usable, and made it look like the only sensible way to fight. He had his own school, his own students, his own certainty. Where the older man was rough and strange, Kojiro was flawless. 2 undefeated masters in one country was one too many. A duel was set, a small island, a single morning, and everyone who loved the sword understood that this was the one that would matter. On the way to the island, alone in a small boat, he did something strange. He took the spare wooden oar and began to carve it into a sword longer than any real one. Longer by a hand's width than Kojiro's famous blade. He had already fought the duel out here on the quiet water before either man had drawn. He would outreach the longest reach in Japan with a piece of a boat. Then he had the boatman slow. He came late again. He let Kojiro stand on the shore and burn with waiting. And he stepped out with the sun low behind him, so his rival would have to search for him through the glare. Kojiro drew that long, beautiful sword flashing up in one perfect motion, and its very tip cut the headband from the older man's brow. A hair higher and it would have found his skull, but in the same breath the wooden sword was already falling. Once. And the greatest swordsman almost no one now remembers was lying on the sand, with the tide already reaching for him. It had lasted a single heartbeat. Kojiro had done nothing wrong. He had simply met a man who won the fight before he ever left the boat. The victor did not linger over him. He bowed, once, and rode away across the bright, indifferent water. That duel is still told today, 400 years on. Two masters, one island, one strike. But something in him went quiet after it. He was past 30 now. He had climbed the entire mountain he had set out to climb as a boy, fought the best men alive, and stood at the top of it, alone. And he found that the view did not hold him the way he had always believed it would. He kept a sword, but he stopped hunting for reasons to draw it. The question that had driven his whole life had, very quietly, been answered. And a life still needs a question. So he turned the same eye onto other things. He painted bare branches, single birds, a few strokes of black ink holding a great deal of silence. He carved, he shaped gardens. People were surprised, but he was not really doing anything new. It was the same discipline as the sword. See the whole, waste nothing. Let the hand move only when it is certain. There is a painting of his, just a small bird on a dead branch, that people still travel a long way to stand in front of. They say it is one of the loneliest things they have ever looked at. When he was old and his body had finally begun to slow, he did the last thing anyone would have expected of a man like him. He went looking for silence. He found a cave in the hills above an old temple, cold and narrow and open to the wind at one end, and he climbed up into it alone. No students, no opponents, nothing left to beat. He was going to try to write it down, a whole life of the sword. The timing, the distance, the empty place at the center of everything. All the things his hands had known that his mouth had never needed to say. He wrote for weeks by candlelight on the cold stone floor. He made it a book of 5 parts and named them for earth, water, fire, wind, and the void. It reads like a manual for fighting, and it is one. But under the guards and the strikes is something quieter and much larger. A way of meeting anything at all. Master one thing completely, he wrote, and you begin to see the way of all things. Pay attention. Cut away whatever is not needed. And do not fear the empty space. That is where everything actually happens. A few days before he died, he wrote one last short thing. A list of how he had lived. Do not regret what you have done. Do not seek out comfort. Do not hold on to things. Walk the road alone. Reading it, you feel the price of him. No home, no wife, no student who stayed until the end. The finest swordsman his country ever made was also one of its loneliest men, and he seems to have chosen every inch of it. He gave the finished book to a young follower so that it would not be lost. And then, with nothing left to win, in the cold and the quiet, he let go. The cave is still there. You can climb up to it and sit where he sat and look out at the same unhurried trees. And the book he wrote in the cold has never once gone out of print, read now by soldiers and swordsmen, but also by people who will never lift a blade in their lives. and who found in a manual about fighting something that quietly helped them live. It is a strange kind of victory that a man who spent his whole life learning how to end things should be remembered, most of all for what he finally understood when he stopped.
I keep thinking about him at the top of everything, rowing away alone. He had beaten the whole world, and it still was not the thing he was after. I'm not sure he ever found a word for what that was, but he spent his last years trying to write it down. I wonder what you would have asked him. What about you? Good night.